The conference room on Coalition Station 7 was silent. 47 species sat around the circular table, each representative staring at the holographic display floating in the center. The display showed 3 colony worlds burning. Red markers indicated Zrath Empire forces spreading across the surface like a disease. Captain Jake Morrison stood near the back wall, his arms crossed. He was the only human in the room, brought in as an observer for the emergency session. His dark hair was cut military short, and his uniform bore the insignia of Earth's defense fleet. He watched the alien leaders debate, his jaw tightening with each passing minute. High Counselor Vexnar, a tall Kryn with blue-scaled skin and 4 eyes, stood at the head of the table. His voice was calm and measured. "We must respond according to the Warfare Accord. Send the Zrath a formal declaration of intent. Give them 48 hours to withdraw." "They've already ignored 3 declarations," Admiral Torvek said. The amphibious Quellan gestured at the burning worlds on display. "They're killing civilians." "Then we must show them what civilized warfare looks like," Vexnar replied. "We engage their military forces in open battle. We give proper warning before orbital strikes. We maintain the ceasefire periods for casualty recovery." Jake couldn't stay quiet anymore. "They're not going to follow any of those rules." Every head in the room turned to look at him. Vexnar's 4 eyes narrowed. "Captain Morrison, you're here to observe, not participate." "With respect, sir, I've been observing for the past hour. You're fighting an enemy that doesn't care about your rules." Jake stepped forward, pointing at the display. "They hit civilian targets first. They use your ceasefire periods to dig in deeper. Every time you warn them about an orbital strike, they evacuate their troops and let the buildings full of prisoners take the hit." "What would you have us do?" Vexnar asked. His tone suggested he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "Hit them where it hurts. Take out their supply lines. Use deception. Make them think you're attacking from the east while you hit from the west. Cut off their command structure. Make them afraid." The room erupted in shocked whispers. A Felnor delegate with gray fur actually stood up. "You're describing terrorism." "I'm describing war," Jake said flatly. Vexnar raised one hand, and the room fell silent. "Captain Morrison, humanity has been part of this coalition for 15 years. In that time, we have tried to educate your species on proper military conduct. The Warfare Accord exists because civilized species do not engage in the barbaric tactics you describe. Those tactics kept humanity alive for thousands of years." "Yes, fighting yourselves on one primitive world," Vexnar said. "This is galactic civilization. We have evolved beyond such brutality." Jake felt his face flush, but he kept his voice level. "Then I hope your evolution is enough to win this war." The meeting continued for another 3 hours. The coalition leadership agreed on a battle plan that followed every rule in the Warfare Accord. They would mass their fleets, engage the Zrath in traditional formation combat, and maintain all proper protocols. Jake watched them carefully organize their own defeat. 2 weeks later, the coalition had lost 7 more worlds. Jake stood in the observation deck of his ship, the Defiant, watching the news feeds from the front lines. His tactical officer, Commander Lisa Hayes, stood beside him. She was a tall woman with short blonde hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. "They're getting slaughtered," Lisa said quietly. "They won't adapt," Jake replied. "They'd rather die honorably than live by bending their rules." Lisa pulled up a tactical report on her datapad. "The Zrath are using every trick in the book. They disguise military transports as medical ships. They fake surrender to get close to coalition vessels. They execute prisoners in view of coalition forces to bait them into breaking formation. And the coalition refuses to respond in kind. Can you blame them?" Lisa looked at Jake. "These species have been at peace for 300 years. Their last war was a border dispute that got settled with a chess match." Jake almost smiled. "A chess match? Okay, the alien equivalent. But you get my point. They don't think like we do." The comm system beeped. A priority message, encrypted with Jake's personal code. He moved to a private terminal and opened it. The face that appeared on screen was older, scarred, and very tired. Colonel Ben Harris had been Jake's commanding officer years ago, back when they fought together in the border wars. "Jake, if you're seeing this, I'm probably dead or about to be," Ben said. The recording was grainy, clearly sent through damaged equipment. "I'm on Meridian Prime with 10,000 civilians. Coalition forces just retreated. Said they needed to regroup and reorganize. The Zarath will be here in 6 hours." Jake felt his stomach drop. "The Coalition commander won't evacuate the civilians. Says it would signal weakness and encourage the Zarath to target more civilian centers." I tried to argue, but he pulled rank. Ben paused, looking off-screen at something. "I know you're under orders to stay defensive. I know what I'm asking. But these are families, Jake. Kids. They're going to die because the Coalition won't break their precious protocols." The message ended with coordinates and encryption keys for Meridian Prime's defense grid. Lisa had moved up behind Jake. She'd seen the message over his shoulder. "If we go, we'll be court-martialed. If we don't go, Ben dies, 10,000 civilians die. The Coalition gave us direct orders, defensive positions only. They don't trust us in offensive operations." Jake closed his eyes, thinking of Ben. Thinking of 10,000 people waiting to die because following the rules was more important than saving lives. He thought about every war humanity had ever fought, every time they'd done something ugly and brutal because the alternative was extinction. "Get the crew ready," Jake said. "Plot a course to Meridian Prime." "Jake, I know." He turned to face her. "Court-martial, maybe prison. Definitely the end of my career. I know all of it." Lisa studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll inform the crew. They'll volunteer. You know they will. Tell them exactly what this means. No sugarcoating." "They're human," Lisa said. "They already know what it means to do what must be done." As Lisa left to prepare the ship, the Defiant dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Meridian Prime system. Jake stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display update with new information. The planet appeared on screen, and even from this distance he could see the fires. "Zarath forces just entered orbit," Lisa reported from her station. 12 warships plus transport vessels. They're beginning orbital bombardment of the northern continent." "Where's Ben?" "Southern continent, industrial sector. The civilians are in the old mining shelters, underground, reinforced. They can survive the bombardment for maybe 6 hours. And then? The Zarath will send ground forces. Those shelters will become tombs." Jake turned to his communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez. She was young, barely 25, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Amy, activate the electronic warfare suite. I want every signal we broadcast to look like it's coming from somewhere else." "That's against Coalition protocol, sir." "I know. Do it anyway." Amy hesitated for only a second, then her fingers flew across her console. "Done. We'll appear on their sensors as a Quellan merchant vessel." "Good. Now broadcast a distress signal. Make it sound panicked. We're a merchant ship carrying medical supplies, and our engines just failed." Lisa looked up from her station. "You're using ourselves as bait. The Zarath have been ignoring Coalition rules about civilian vessels. Let's see if they take the bait." The Defiant drifted toward Meridian Prime, broadcasting its fake distress signal. On the tactical display, Jake watched 3 Zarath warships break formation and move to intercept. They probably thought an easy capture would be a nice bonus. They were wrong. "Weapons range in 30 seconds, Lisa said. "Hold fire. Let them get close." The crew was silent, watching the Zarath ships approach. Jake could feel the tension on the bridge. Everyone knew what they were about to do, violated every rule the Coalition held sacred. They were pretending to be civilians to lure enemy ships into a trap. The Coalition would call it a war crime. 20 seconds. Steady. 10 seconds. They're powering weapons. Now, Jake said calmly. The Defiant dropped its false identity. Its real transponder activated, showing a human military vessel. At the same moment, its weapon systems came online. The Zarath ships, expecting an easy target, suddenly found themselves facing a warship at point-blank range. The Defiant fired. Railgun rounds tore through the first Zarath ship's hull. Missiles launched from the torpedo bays, crossing the short distance in seconds. Two of the Zrath ships exploded. The third tried to retreat, but it was too late. The Defiant's main cannon fired, a beam of concentrated energy that cut the enemy vessel in half. 3 ships down, Lisa reported. The other 9 are moving to engage. Get us into the atmosphere. Use the planet's magnetic field to hide our position. The Defiant dove toward Meridian Prime, entering the upper atmosphere at dangerous speeds. The ship shook and rattled, but the crew held their positions. Behind them, the Zrath warships followed, firing as they came. Launching countermeasures, Amy said. Small drones shot out from the Defiant's hull, each one broadcasting a signal identical to the ship's own signature. The Zrath sensors suddenly showed 20 targets instead of 1. Take us through that storm system, Jake ordered, pointing at a massive hurricane on the display. Sir, the turbulence will tear us apart. It'll tear them apart too, but we're smaller and more maneuverable. The Defiant plunged into the storm. Lightning cracked around the hull. Wind speeds exceeded 500 kilometers per hour. 2 Zrath ships tried to follow. The first one lost control and crashed into the ocean. The second one pulled up, refusing to risk the same fate. The Defiant emerged on the other side of the storm, heading for the southern continent. Behind them, the remaining Zrath ships took a longer route around the weather system. That gave the Defiant precious time. Hailing Colonel Harris now, Amy said. Ben's face appeared on screen. He looked worse than in his recording. Blood on his uniform, exhaustion in his eyes. Jake, you crazy son of a gun. I didn't think you'd actually come. You asked nicely, where do you need us? The Zrath are landing ground troops 5 kilometers north of our position. They'll reach the shelters in 2 hours. We've got some weapons, but not enough to hold them off. How many troops? Their scanners are counting about 2,000. We've got maybe 300 people who can fight, and most of them are civilians with mining equipment. Jake thought fast. 2,000 enemy troops against 300 barely armed civilians. The coalition would try to negotiate. They would try to find a peaceful solution. They would probably get everyone killed. I'm sending down Lieutenant Rodriguez with a team. They'll bring weapons and supplies. Jake, the coalition will have your head for this. Probably, but you'll be alive to watch the trial. Jake cut the connection and turned to Amy. Get a team ready, take weapons, explosives, and anything else that might be useful. And Amy, teach Ben's people how to fight dirty. Amy smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. With pleasure, sir. 20 minutes later, a dropship launched from the Defiant and headed for the surface. On board were 30 Marines and enough weapons to arm a small army. Also on board were mines, explosives, and electronic warfare equipment that the coalition had banned years ago. Jake watched from the bridge as Amy's dropship disappeared into the atmosphere. Lisa, what's the status of those Zrath ships? They're circling, trying to find us. Our electronic warfare is keeping them confused, but they'll figure it out eventually. Then let's give them something else to think about. For the next hour, the Defiant played cat and mouse with the Zrath fleet. It would appear on sensors, fire a few shots, then disappear again. The Zrath ships wasted ammunition shooting at false targets, while the real Defiant stayed hidden in the planet's magnetic interference. On the ground, Amy and her team reached the mining shelters. Ben met them at the entrance, his eyes widening at the crates of weapons and equipment. This is all illegal under coalition law, Ben said. Good thing we're probably going to prison anyway, Amy replied. Let's make it count. She gathered the civilians who could fight and began teaching them. Not coalition warfare with its rules and honor, but human warfare. Brutal, efficient, and effective. She showed them how to set traps, how to ambush, how to make every bullet count because they wouldn't have enough ammunition for a straight fight. Dr. Kate Sullivan, a civilian scientist who worked at the mining facility, approached Amy. I've been working on something, a computer virus that can disable Zrath equipment. The coalition banned cyber warfare. I know, I built it anyway. Kate pulled out a data chip. I just needed someone with the spine to use it. Amy took the chip. Get it ready. When those Zrath troops arrive, I want every piece of their technology to stop working. Back in orbit, Jake watched the clock. The Zrath ground troops were getting closer to the shelters. His ship couldn't help directly without revealing its position to the enemy fleet. Everything depended on Amy and Ben and 300 civilians with borrowed weapons. "Sir, I'm picking up a transmission from Coalition Command," Lisa said. "They're ordering us to return immediately and face disciplinary action." "Ignore it. They're threatening to declare the Defiant a rogue vessel. Let them. We'll sort it out after everyone down there is safe." On the surface, the Zrath troops reached the outskirts of the shelter complex. They advanced in formation, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They expected frightened civilians and maybe a few soldiers trying to defend them. They got something very different. The first mine exploded, taking out the lead squad. The Zrath forces scattered, taking cover. Then the cyber attack hit. Kate's virus spread through their communication network, disabling weapon systems, scrambling their tactical displays, and shutting down their armor. The Zrath soldiers suddenly found themselves blind, confused, and vulnerable. That's when Amy's people hit them. The attack came from everywhere and nowhere. Civilians with mining lasers fired from building windows. Marines with sniper rifles picked off officers. Explosives detonated in unexpected places. The Zrath forces, trained for honorable formation combat, had no idea how to respond to enemies who refused to fight fair. In 30 minutes, it was over. The Zrath troops retreated, leaving half their number dead or wounded. The civilians cheered, exhausted but alive. Jake watched the tactical display as the enemy ground forces fled back to their ships. "Lisa, open a channel to the Zrath fleet." "Channel open. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth vessel Defiant. Leave this system immediately, or we'll do to your ships what we just did to your ground troops." There was a long silence. Then the Zrath warships began moving toward the edge of the system. They jumped to faster-than-light travel without another word. "They're gone," Lisa said, almost disbelieving. Jake sat back in his chair, suddenly feeling very tired. "Get Amy and her team back on board, and start evacuating those civilians, all 10,000 of them. Where are we taking them?" "Coalition Station 7. Let the Council see the people we saved." The tribunal room on Coalition Station 7 was packed. Representatives from 30 species sat in the observation gallery, watching as Captain Jake Morrison stood before the Judicial Council. High Counselor Vexnar sat at the center of 5 judges. His 4 eyes fixed on Jake with an expression that might have been disappointment or anger. It was hard to tell with the grin. "Captain Morrison," Vexnar began, "you are charged with 18 violations of the Warfare Accord. You falsified your ship's identification. You used civilian distress signals as a military tactic. You deployed banned electronic warfare systems. You armed civilians and instructed them in prohibited combat methods. How do you plead?" Jake stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back. "Guilty on all counts, sir." A murmur ran through the observation gallery. Vexnar raised one hand for silence. "You don't deny these charges?" "No, sir. I did everything you said. I'd do it again. Even knowing that your actions violate every principle this coalition stands for?" "Your principles were getting people killed," Jake said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. 10,000 civilians were going to die because following rules was more important than saving lives. I made a choice. Before Vexnar could respond, the doors to the tribunal room burst open. A Quellan officer rushed in, his webbed hands shaking as he held a datapad. "Counselor, urgent news from the front. The Zrath have broken through our defensive line. They're 3 jumps from the capital." The room fell silent. Vexnar's face, if possible, grew even more grim. "How many systems have fallen?" 15 in the last 2 days, sir. Our fleets are in full retreat. The commanders report that traditional tactics are ineffective against the Zrath. They're requesting permission to," the officer hesitated, "to employ human methods." Every eye in the room turned to Jake. He stood perfectly still, waiting. Vexnar studied him for a long moment, then looked at the other judges. They conferred in low voices that Jake couldn't hear. Finally, Vexnar spoke. "Captain Morrison, this tribunal is suspended. You will report to Admiral Chris Bennett immediately. The Coalition Council has made a decision." An hour later, Jake found himself in a strategy room with the Coalition's top military leaders. Admiral Chris Bennett, a gray-haired human with sharp blue eyes, stood at the head of the table. He'd been humanity's representative to coalition defense forces for 10 years. The council has voted, Chris said without preamble. By a margin of 24 to 23, they've granted humanity full operational authority over coalition military forces. Jake blinked. They're putting us in charge? Not exactly. You'll be advising coalition commanders and leading special operations. But yes, you have authority to override traditional protocols when necessary. Chris pulled up a star map. The Zrath control 60 systems now. They're pushing toward the coalition capital. We have maybe 2 weeks before they reach it. What do we have to work with? 300 coalition vessels, 50,000 ground troops, and a lot of species who think we're barbarians. Chris smiled grimly. Standard Tuesday for humanity. Lisa Hayes entered the room, followed by a dozen other human officers. I brought the team, she said to Jake. Figured you'd need help explaining human warfare to people who think a fair fight is a good thing. Chris pulled up a tactical display. The Zrath are moving in 3 main fleets. They're confident, maybe overconfident. They think the coalition is beaten. Then let's teach them why overconfidence is a mistake, Jake said. He studied the map, his mind already working through possibilities. We need to hit them where they don't expect it. Not their fleets, their supply lines. A Quellan admiral named Torvek looked shocked. You want to attack supply ships? That's dishonorable. That's smart, Jake corrected. A warship without fuel and ammunition is just expensive scrap. We cut off their supplies. Their invasion stops. But the Warfare Accord states that supply vessels are not legitimate military targets. The Zrath don't care about the Warfare Accord. They proved that when they started killing civilians. Jake pointed at the map. They're moving fast, which means their supply lines are stretched. We hit them there. They have to choose between advancing or securing their logistics. Either way, they slow down. Chris nodded. I'll prepare orders for raiding parties. What else? We need intelligence. Real intelligence, not just ship movements and troop numbers. I want to know where their commanders are, what they're thinking, what their weaknesses are. You mean spying, a Felnor officer said. Infiltration. The coalition banned such methods a century ago. Then maybe that's why you're losing, Jake said flatly. He turned to Lisa. I need you to set up an intelligence network. Recruit anyone with covert operations experience. I know just the people, Lisa said. Over the next 3 days, humanity transformed the coalition military. Human officers moved through the fleet, teaching crews tactics that had been banned for centuries. They showed them how to use deception, how to set ambushes, how to make the enemy see what you wanted them to see instead of what was real. Commander Ryan Foster, a special operations veteran with a scarred face and cold eyes, took command of Black Operations. He gathered a team of specialists and disappeared into Zrath-controlled space. Their mission was simple and terrifying. Find the Zrath command structure and tear it apart. Captain Nicole Chen, an intelligence officer with a gift for psychological warfare, began a campaign of misinformation. She hacked Zrath communications and fed them false reports. Phantom human fleets appeared on their sensors. Supply convoys that didn't exist drew away their patrols. The Zrath started seeing threats everywhere, but the most controversial operation was General Dan Crawford's plan. Dan was older, in his 60s, with white hair and a reputation for doing whatever worked. He stood before the Coalition Council and explained his idea. We use civilian vessels, he said. Merchant ships, transport vessels, anything that doesn't look military. We load them with marines and weapons, send them into Zrath space, and when they get close to enemy installations, we strike. The council erupted in outrage. You want to disguise military operations as civilian activity? Vexnar demanded. That's a violation of every principle we hold. That's also how you win against an enemy who targets civilians anyway, Dan replied. The Zrath ignore civilian vessels because the Warfare Accord protects them. Let's use their assumptions against them. This is unconscionable. This is war, Dan said. He looked around the room at the alien faces staring at him with shock and disgust. You wanted our help. This is what it looks like. We don't fight fair. We don't fight honorably. We fight to win. The vote was close, but it passed. Human methods were approved. though half the council members looked sick about it. The first strike hit a Zrath supply depot 3 days later. A human freighter, broadcasting civilian identification, approached the depot requesting emergency repairs. The Zrath, following their own protocols about civilian vessels, allowed it to dock. 50 Marines poured out of the cargo bay and seized the entire facility in 12 minutes. The second strike targeted a Zrath communications relay. Commander Ryan Foster's team infiltrated the station disguised as maintenance workers. They planted explosives and disappeared. When the station exploded, the Zrath fleet in that sector went blind. The third strike was Captain Nicole Chen's work. She intercepted a Zrath fleet commander's personal communications and learned he had a family back in Zrath space. She sent him a message, carefully crafted to suggest his family was in danger from political rivals. The commander abandoned his post and rushed home. His fleet, without leadership, fell into confusion. One by one, the human operations chipped away at Zrath confidence. Supply ships started requiring military escorts, which pulled warships away from the front. Commanders became paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere. Troops grew nervous, wondering what the humans would do next. But not everyone approved. A coalition observer named Commander Targan, a dignified Kryn officer, followed Jake's operations for 2 weeks. He documented everything in detailed reports, his face growing grimmer with each human tactic he witnessed. After a particularly brutal raid where humans destroyed a Zrath munitions factory, Targan confronted Jake in the strategy room. "You killed 300 workers in that factory. Workers, not soldiers." "Workers who were making bombs that kill coalition civilians," Jake replied. "They were non-combatants. They were building weapons. That makes them part of the war effort." Jake met Targan's eyes. "I don't like it either. But we're not fighting for fun. We're fighting to survive." "At what cost?" Targan gestured at the tactical displays showing multiple human operations. "You've turned this into a war without rules, without honor." "Honor is a luxury. Ask the people we pulled off Meridian Prime if they care about honor." Jake's voice was hard. "Ask the 10,000 civilians we saved if they'd rather be dead and honorable or alive and compromised." Targan shook his head. "I don't know if this is salvation or damnation." "Maybe it's both," Jake said. "But it's keeping people alive. That's all that matters right now." The Zrath advance slowed, then stopped. Their supply lines were too vulnerable. Their communications were compromised. Their commanders were making mistakes, second-guessing themselves, jumping at shadows. But then the Zrath Emperor made his move. A message came through on all coalition channels. The Emperor himself appeared on screen, a massive reptilian creature with cold eyes. Behind him, Jake could see rows and rows of prisoners. Coalition soldiers, civilians, people from a dozen species. "You have 48 hours, the Emperor said. "Surrender, or I execute 1 million prisoners. All of them. Every single one." The transmission ended. The Coalition Council sat in stunned silence. Vexnar looked at Jake with something that might have been fear. "What do we do?" The briefing room was quiet except for Jake's voice. He stood at the front, explaining Operation Blackout to a room full of officers who looked increasingly horrified as he spoke. "The Zrath Emperor is in his fortress on Krathval Prime. That's where he's keeping the prisoners. The fortress has shields, anti-orbital weapons, and 10,000 guards. It's designed to be impenetrable." Jake brought up a holographic display of the fortress. It was massive, built into a mountain, with defenses that would make any assault suicidal. "So we're not going to assault it," Jake continued. "We're going to infiltrate it." "How?" Admiral Chris Bennett asked. "The fortress processes supply deliveries every day. Food, equipment, replacement troops. We take over one of those supply ships, fill it with our people, and get ourselves delivered right to the front door." Commander Lisa Hayes studied the display. "They'll scan the ship. They'll find us. Not if we're inside cargo containers lined with sensor-blocking material. Yes, it'll be cramped. Yes, it'll be uncomfortable. But it'll get us inside." Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez raised her hand. She'd been promoted after Meridian Prime. "Once we're inside, what then?" "We split into 3 teams. Team 1 heads for the prison blocks to extract the prisoners. Team 2 takes control of the fortress shields and weapon systems. Team 3 goes after the Emperor. The room fell silent. A Quellan officer named Ventar finally spoke. You're planning to assassinate a head of state. I'm planning to remove a military commander who's threatening to execute 1,000,000 prisoners, Jake corrected. The Emperor isn't just a political leader. He's the supreme military commander of the Zrath forces. Remove him. And their chain of command collapses. This is madness, Ventar said. The casualty rate for this operation would be catastrophic. 80%, Jake agreed. We're looking at losing 4 out of 5 people we send in. But if we don't go, 1,000,000 people die. So yes, it's a terrible plan, but it's the only plan we have. Admiral Chris Bennett stood. I'll lead Team 3. No, sir, I will, Jake said. Captain, you've already risked your life multiple times. Let someone else. With respect, Admiral, this was my idea. I'm not sending people to do something I'm not willing to do myself. Chris studied Jake for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Who else volunteers? Every human in the room raised their hand. Then, slowly, some of the alien officers did too. Ventar looked at his own hand, seeming surprised to find it raised. I must be insane, he muttered. One officer who didn't volunteer was Lieutenant Laura Stevens. She was a medic, a woman in her 30s with red hair and steady hands. She'd joined the fleet to heal people, not to watch them die. I'm not going, Laura said quietly. Jake looked at her. That's your choice. No one has to volunteer for this. I'm not going because I think it's wrong, Laura continued, louder now. We've spent the last month doing terrible things, killing workers, lying, using civilians as camouflage, and now we're planning a suicide mission to assassinate a head of state. When does it stop? When do we draw the line? The room was silent. Jake met her eyes. After we save 1,000,000 people, then we can talk about lines. What if saving them costs us our souls? Laura asked. Then that's the price we pay, Jake said. Someone has to pay it. Might as well be us. Laura stood up and walked to the front of the room. I'm going with you. Someone needs to be there to patch up what's left when this is over. Someone needs to remember that we're supposed to be the good guys. Jake nodded. Welcome aboard, Doctor. The preparation took 3 days. 200 volunteers, human and alien, trained for the operation. They practiced moving through tight spaces, learned the fortress layout, and came to terms with the fact that most of them wouldn't come home. Sergeant Matt Cooper, a demolitions expert with a talent for making things explode, spent those 3 days preparing charges. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a quiet manner that hid a fierce determination. I've got enough explosives here to level a city block, Matt said to Jake. Once we're inside, I can blow the shields, the power generators, and probably half the mountain. How long do you need? Give me 20 minutes alone with their infrastructure, and I'll bring it all down. On the eve of the operation, High Counselor Vexnar requested a private meeting with Jake. They met in an observation lounge overlooking the fleet. Through the window, they could see dozens of coalition vessels preparing for battle. I've been reviewing your record, Vexnar said. Before this war, you had an exemplary service history. You followed protocols. You respected the warfare accord. What changed? Jake looked out at the stars. I saw people dying because we cared more about rules than results. I decided results were more important. Even if those results require you to become the very thing we're fighting against? The Zrath kill because they want to conquer. We kill because we want to protect. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? Vexnar turned to face Jake. They believe their cause is just too. Every war criminal in history thought they were doing the right thing. Maybe they were, Jake said. Maybe sometimes the right thing looks wrong from the outside. Maybe that's the burden of command, making choices that will haunt you forever because the alternative is worse. Vexnar was quiet for a long moment. I have been a prisoner of the Zrath, Captain Morrison. Did you know that? Jake turned, surprised. No, sir. 2 weeks ago, I was on Meridian 7 when the Zrath attacked. They captured several council members. They did things to us, to my aide. I watched him die slowly while they laughed. Vexnar's voice was steady, but his hands shook. Your Commander Foster's team rescued us 5 days ago. They killed every Zrath guard in that facility. Efficient. Brutal. Without mercy. I'm sorry you had to see that, sir. Don't be. I needed to see it. I needed to understand that my ideals about civilized warfare only work when everyone agrees to be civilized. Vexnar met Jake's eyes. I still think your methods are barbaric, but I'm alive because of them. That's a difficult truth to reconcile. I know, sir. We live with difficult truths every day. The next morning, the operation began. A captured Zrath supply ship, now crewed by humans, approached Krathval Prime. In its cargo hold, sealed inside sensor-proof containers, 200 soldiers waited in darkness. Jake sat in his container, feeling the ship shake as it entered the atmosphere. Next to him, Commander Ryan Foster checked his weapons for the 10th time. Across from them, Laura Stevens clutched her medical bag like a lifeline. 5 minutes, Amy Rodriguez's voice came through their earpieces. She was piloting the supply ship, flying it directly into the fortress. The ship landed. Jake heard voices outside, Zrath guards checking the cargo. His hand moved to his weapon. If they were discovered now, they'd be dead before they could fight back. But the sensors didn't penetrate the containers. The guards cleared the ship and began unloading cargo. Jake felt his container being lifted, moved, set down. Footsteps. Voices fading. Clear, Amy's voice said. You're inside. The containers opened. 200 soldiers emerged into a storage bay deep in the fortress. They split into their teams immediately, moving with practiced efficiency. Jake led Team 3 down a corridor, heading for the Emperor's chambers. They encountered their first guards 2 minutes in. Matt Cooper threw a flash grenade. The team moved through the stunned guards like ghosts, silent and deadly. They reached the fortress power station. Matt went to work with his explosives while the team held the entrance. Zrath soldiers poured in, and the corridor became a killing zone. Jake fired until his weapon overheated, then drew another. Done, Matt said. Shields will be down in 90 seconds. Move out, Jake ordered. They fought their way up through the fortress. Every corridor was a battle. Every room cost them lives. Sergeant Matt Cooper took a plasma bolt to the shoulder but kept moving, one arm hanging useless. Commander Ryan Foster was hit in the leg but refused to stop. Team 1 reached the prison blocks. Colonel Ben Harris, who had insisted on volunteering despite his age, led the prisoners out. 1 million people, weak from captivity, stumbling toward freedom. Ben stayed at the rear, holding off Zrath soldiers so the prisoners could escape. He took 3 hits but kept fighting until the last prisoner was clear. Team 2 seized the control room. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez locked the Zrath out of their own systems and opened the fortress to the Coalition fleet waiting in orbit. Team 3 reached the Emperor's chambers. The massive doors were sealed, guarded by his personal elite. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. Half of Team 3 died in those hallways. Jake and Ryan breached the final door to find the Emperor waiting with a weapon. The Emperor was huge, towering over them, his eyes full of rage. He fired. Ryan pushed 6 months had passed since the fall of Krathval Prime. The Zrath Empire had collapsed into civil war, its territory divided among warlords who fought each other instead of the Coalition. The threat was over. The crisis had passed. But the scars remained. Jake stood in the memorial hall on Coalition Station 7. The wall before him stretched 50 meters long and 10 meters high, covered entirely with names. The dead from the war. Coalition soldiers, human marines, civilians caught in the crossfire. Too many names. Far too many. He found Ryan Foster's name near the top. Ben Harris was 3 rows down. The names of the 42 soldiers who never came back from Operation Blackout were clustered together, a permanent reminder of the price of victory. I come here every day, a voice said behind him. Jake turned to find High Counselor Vexnar standing there. The Kryn looked older than he had 6 months ago, his scales duller, his movements slower. So do I, Jake said. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 former adversaries united by loss. Finally, Vexnar spoke. The Coalition Council is holding a ceremony today, to honor those who fell. I wanted to speak with you first. About what? About what I'm going to say. Vexnar moved closer to the wall, his eyes scanning the names. For 3 centuries, the Coalition has prided itself on civilized warfare. We created the Warfare Accord to prevent the brutality we saw in ancient histories. We believed we had evolved beyond savagery. Past tense? Jake asked. Yes, past tense. Vexnar looked at Jake. I have been reviewing human history. Your wars, your struggles, the way you fight each other and your own planet. Do you know what I found? That we're barbaric? That you're pragmatic. Every human conflict I studied showed the same pattern. You analyze the problem, you find the most effective solution, and you execute it regardless of how it looks to others. Not because you enjoy violence, but because you understand that survival requires adaptability. Vexnar gestured at the memorial wall. We called your methods barbaric. We condemned you for breaking our rules. But these people are alive today because you were willing to do what we could not, because you cared more about results than reputation. We also killed a lot of people, Jake said quietly. Workers in factories, supply ship crews, guards who might have been conscripted against their will. That blood is on our hands. Yes, and you will carry that burden for the rest of your life. That's the difference between you and the Zrath. Vexnar placed one hand on the wall of names. They killed without remorse. You kill despite it. You accept the moral weight of your actions. That's what makes you civilized, not your methods. I'm not sure the families of the dead would agree. Perhaps not, but they're alive to disagree, which is more than they would have been under our old protocols. Ambassador Helen Carter arrived, followed by several coalition diplomats. She was a tall woman with gray hair and tired eyes. She'd spent the last 6 months negotiating peace treaties and reparations agreements. The ceremony starts in an hour, Helen said. Captain Morrison, Admiral Bennett wants you there. I'm not sure I should be, Jake said. Half the council still thinks you're a war criminal, Helen admitted. The other half thinks you're a hero. Either way, you need to be there. The ceremony was held in the Grand Hall, a massive circular chamber that could hold thousands. Every coalition species was represented. The rescued prisoners filled the front rows, 1 million beings from dozens of worlds. Behind them sat the families of those who had died. Admiral Chris Bennett stood at the podium. He looked older too, his hair completely white now, lines etched deep in his face. We gather today to remember those who gave everything so that others might live, he began. This war tested us in ways we never imagined. It forced us to make choices we never wanted to make. It showed us truths about ourselves that many of us still struggle to accept. Chris gestured to the memorial wall display projected behind him. These names represent sacrifice. Not just sacrifice of life, but sacrifice of innocence. Many who fought in this war did things that haunt them. They broke rules they believed in. They became what they never wanted to be. And they did it anyway, because someone had to. In the audience, Laura Stevens sat with other survivors of Operation Blackout. She wore her medals but looked uncomfortable with them. Next to her, Sergeant Matt Cooper sat with his arm still in a sling, his face impassive. High Counselor Vexnar took the podium next. The hall fell silent. Everyone knew he had opposed human methods throughout the war. His opinion mattered. I stand before you today to admit I was wrong, Vexnar said. His voice was clear and steady. I believed that civilized warfare meant following rules, maintaining honor, conducting ourselves with dignity even in conflict. I believed that those who broke these rules were barbarians, unworthy of our civilization. He paused, his 4 eyes scanning the crowd. Then I was captured by the Zrath. I spent 2 weeks in their prison. I watched them torture my aide to death for entertainment. I saw what happens when one side follows the rules and the other doesn't. I learned that honor is meaningless to an enemy who has none. Vexnar looked directly at Jake, who sat in the 3rd row. Captain Morrison and his people saved my life. They saved all of us. They did terrible things to accomplish this. They killed. They deceived. They violated every protocol we held sacred. And I am alive because of it. The counselor's voice grew stronger. I have struggled these past months to reconcile what I believe with what I know to be true. I believe in peace. I believe in honor. I believe in the principles that founded this coalition. But I also know that these principles only work when everyone agrees to them. When faced with an enemy who recognizes no rules, we must adapt or die." He gestured to the audience. Humanity adapted. They fought in ways that made us uncomfortable. They bore the moral burden so we would not have to. They accepted being called barbarians so that we could remain civilized. That is not savagery. That is sacrifice of the highest order. The hall erupted in applause, though not everyone joined in. Some species still couldn't accept what had happened, still couldn't reconcile survival with the methods used to achieve it. But they were alive to object, which was the point. After the ceremony, Jake walked through the station corridors. He passed grateful civilians who thanked him. He passed coalition officers who looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. He passed protesters who carried signs calling him a war criminal. Maybe he was both. Maybe that was the truth humanity had learned over millennia of fighting. Sometimes the person who saves you is also the person you fear. Sometimes heroes look like villains. Sometimes doing the right thing requires doing terrible things. He found Ambassador Helen Carter in her office, reviewing reports. She looked up as he entered. "How are you holding up?" "I'm alive. Ryan, Ben, and the others aren't. I'm still figuring out how I feel about that." Helen closed her datapad. "The Council has asked me to propose something to you. They want to establish a new defense academy, a place where coalition forces can learn tactical flexibility, unconventional warfare, adaptive strategy, all the things humans do naturally but other species need to learn. They want us to teach them how to fight dirty. They want to survive the next threat without losing everything they believe in first." Helen leaned back in her chair. "They're offering you the position of commandant. You'd train the next generation of coalition defenders. Half the council hates me. Half the council is alive because of you. That counts for something." Jake thought about it. Teaching young soldiers how to make the hard choices. Watching them struggle with the same moral dilemmas he faced. Seeing them lose their innocence the way he lost his. "I don't know if I can do that." "You're the only one who can, because you understand the cost." Helen pulled up a file on her screen. "The first class is already assembled. 50 students from 20 different species. One of them is Private Danny Price, human, 19 years old. He grew up hearing stories about the war. He wants to serve. He wants to protect people. He needs someone to teach him how to do that without losing himself in the process. That's a tall order. That's leadership." Jake met with the first class a week later. 50 young beings, barely adults, looking at him with a mixture of hope and nervousness. Private Danny Price sat in the front row, his young face eager and earnest. "This academy will teach you things your species consider controversial," Jake began. "Deception, psychological warfare, how to identify and exploit enemy weaknesses, how to fight enemies who don't follow any rules." He paused, making eye contact with each student. "But before I teach you how to do these things, I need you to understand why we do them. We don't fight dirty because we're evil. We fight dirty because we're desperate. Because the alternative is watching people die while we maintain our principles." A Quellen student raised a webbed hand. "How do we know when it's okay to break the rules?" "You never know for sure," Jake said honestly. "You make the best choice you can with the information you have. Sometimes you'll be right. Sometimes you'll be wrong. Either way, you'll have to live with it." Danny Price raised his hand. "What if people hate us for what we do?" "They probably will. Half of them anyway." Jake smiled sadly. "That's part of the burden. You do what must be done, knowing that people will judge you for it. Some will call you a hero, some will call you a monster. Most days you'll wonder which one is right." "Which one is right?" Danny asked. "Neither. Both. It depends on the day." Jake looked at the young faces staring at him. "But here's what I know for sure. Every person we saved during the war is alive today. Every child who would have been killed by the Zarath is growing up safe. Every family that would have been destroyed is still together. That's what matters. Not what people call us. Not how history remembers us. The lives we saved." Over the following months, the academy grew. Coalition officers came to learn human tactics, and slowly, painfully, began to understand the difference between brutality and pragmatism. They learned that fighting to win wasn't the same as fighting for pleasure. They learned that survival sometimes required sacrifice of more than just life. Commander Sarah Blake, a young human officer, became Jake's deputy. She represented the next generation, people who grew up with both human pragmatism and coalition ideals. Her approach synthesized the best of both, showing that adaptation didn't mean abandoning principles entirely. One day, Jake received a visit from Laura Stevens. She'd left the military after the war, unable to reconcile what she'd seen and done. But she'd written a book about her experiences, a memoir that became required reading across coalition space. "I wanted to thank you," Laura said. "For what?" "For not lying to me. For admitting that what we did was terrible. For carrying the burden without pretending it wasn't heavy." She handed him a copy of her book. "I wrote this so people would understand. So they'd know that the soldiers who saved them paid a price for it. So they'd remember that freedom isn't free, and sometimes the price is moral complexity." Jake opened the book. The dedication read, "For those who do terrible things so others don't have to. For those who bear the weight so others can stay light. For those who break rules to protect people, this is your story." "It's a good dedication," Jake said. "It's an honest one." 6 months became a year. A year became 2. The Academy graduated its first class. Private Danny Price, now Sergeant Danny Price, took his place as a coalition defender. He'd learned the lessons well. He understood that pragmatism wasn't cruelty, that adaptation wasn't abandonment of principles, that sometimes the right choice looked wrong from the outside. A new threat appeared at the edge of coalition space, a distress signal from a colony under attack by raiders. The Coalition Council convened immediately, but this time no one hesitated. No one debated proper protocols. They called the Academy. They called the human advisors. They asked what should be done, and humans, who had learned through centuries of struggle how to do what must be done, gave their answer. Not with pride, not with pleasure, but with the grim determination of people who understood that survival required paying prices others couldn't afford. The Defiant launched alongside coalition vessels. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on its bridge, older now, carrying scars both visible and hidden. Beside him, Commander Sarah Blake checked tactical displays. Behind them, a crew of humans and aliens worked together, united by purpose if not always by method. "Sir, we're approaching the colony," Lisa Hayes reported. She'd stayed with Jake through everything, loyal to the end. "Any sign of the raiders?" "They're in orbit, bombarding civilian centers." Jake felt the old anger rise. The same anger that had driven him to Meridian Prime, to Krath Val Prime, to every battle where innocent people needed protecting. "Then let's teach them why that's a mistake. All ships, execute attack pattern Morrison 7. The Coalition fleet moved with precision born of human training. They didn't announce their presence. They didn't give warnings. They hit fast and hard, using every tactic that had once been called barbaric. And the raiders, expecting an honorable fight, found themselves facing an enemy who cared only about results. The battle was over in an hour. The colony was saved. And the council members, watching from their chambers, didn't flinch. They'd learned. They'd adapted. They'd accepted that survival sometimes required getting your hands dirty. High Counselor Vexnar watched the battle reports with a mixture of emotions. Pride that his people had learned, sadness for what they'd had to become. Understanding that both feelings could coexist. "We call it pragmatic warfare now," Vexnar said to his aide. "What do the humans call it?" the aide asked. Vexnar smiled slightly. "Doing what must be done." And in the end, both terms meant the same thing. The willingness to pay any price, bear any burden, accept any judgment, to protect those who could not protect themselves. The understanding. 3 years after the end of the Zrath War, Coalition space had settled into an uneasy peace. The scars remained visible everywhere. Rebuilt colonies bore fresh construction. Memorial walls on every station listed names of the fallen. And throughout the fleet, human advisors worked alongside coalition officers, teaching lessons that still made many uncomfortable. Ambassador Greg Mitchell stood in the Coalition Council chambers, presenting the annual defense report. Greg was younger than Helen Carter had been, in his 40s, with sharp features and a direct manner that some found refreshing and others found abrasive. Pirate activity is down 60%, Greg reported, pulling up statistics on the holographic display. Raider attacks have nearly stopped. Border disputes are resolved through shows of force rather than extended conflicts. The coalition hasn't lost a single world to hostile action in 2 years. Because we fight like humans now, Counselor Zick said. The insectoid alien clicked his mandibles in what might have been approval or disgust. We ambush. We deceive. We strike without warning. We survive, Greg corrected. Isn't that what matters? The council chamber had changed over the past 3 years. New species had joined, impressed by the coalition's military effectiveness. Old species had adapted their thinking, accepting that their 3 centuries of peace had been an anomaly, not the natural state of the galaxy. And humans, once viewed with suspicion, were now integrated throughout coalition command structure. But integration brought new challenges. Not every species adapted well to human methods. Not every officer could make the mental shift from honorable warfare to pragmatic warfare. And not every human remembered why they fought the way they did. At the Defense Academy, Admiral Jake Morrison dealt with these challenges daily. His 3rd class of students had just graduated, and his 4th was proving difficult. Too many young humans who thought pragmatic warfare meant being cruel. Too many coalition students who still flinched at necessary actions. You're teaching them wrong, a voice said from the doorway. Jake looked up from his desk to see Dr. Kate Sullivan standing there. The scientist who had created the virus that crippled Zrath systems had become an unlikely voice of conscience in the years since the war. She'd written extensively about the ethics of warfare, becoming required reading for anyone who thought deeply about these issues. I'm teaching them what works, Jake said. You're teaching them to win. That's not the same thing. Kate sat down across from him. I've been reviewing the latest Academy reports. Your students are becoming efficient. Maybe too efficient. They're not asking the questions they should be asking. What questions? Is this necessary? Is this proportional? Is this the minimum force required? Kate leaned forward. Jake, you fought in a war where these questions had clear answers. The Zrath were going to kill everyone. Every tactic you used was justified by immediate survival. But your students are learning these tactics in peacetime, applying them to pirates and raiders. The moral calculations are different. Jake thought about Ryan Foster, Ben Harris, and all the others whose names were on memorial walls. If I teach them to hesitate, they'll die. If you teach them not to think, they'll become what we fought against. Before Jake could respond, an alarm sounded throughout the station. Priority alert. Emergency council session. Jake and Kate rushed to the command center, where Admiral Chris Bennett was already coordinating responses to something. What's happening? Jake asked. Chris pulled up a star map. Unknown vessels just appeared at Sector 7-9. 12 ships, all heavily armed. They're not responding to hails. Identification? None. But Jake, look at their formation. Jake studied the tactical display, his blood running cold. The formation was familiar. Not Zrath, but similar. Aggressive, overlapping fields of fire, positioned to maximize damage while minimizing risk. This was a military force, well-trained and disciplined. They're heading for Vega Colony, Chris said. 4 million civilians. We have ships in the area, but they're outnumbered. How long until they reach the colony? 6 hours. Jake thought fast. 6 hours meant no time for deliberation, no time for debate. The coalition had faced threats before in the past 3 years, but nothing like this. Nothing that required the level of response they'd used against the Zrath. I need full tactical control, Jake said. You have it, Chris replied immediately. The next 6 hours were a blur of activity. Jake coordinated fleet movements, positioned assets, prepared strategies. But this time felt different. This time they had options. The unknown ships hadn't killed anyone yet. They hadn't declared hostile intent. They were just moving toward a colony with weapons ready. The old Jake, the one from the Zrath War, would have hit them immediately, ambushed them, disabled them. Eliminate the threat before it could materialize. But Kate's words echoed in his mind. Is this necessary? Is this proportional? Open a channel to the lead ship, Jake ordered. All frequencies. Sir, they haven't responded to any hails, the communications officer said. Try again. Keep trying until they answer or until they fire. Those are our two conditions for attack. The fleet moved into position around Vega Colony. The unknown ships approached, their weapons powered but not targeting. And still, they didn't respond to hails. In the council chambers, the debate raged. We should strike now, argued a Felnor admiral, before they're in range of the colony. We don't know their intentions, Councillor Zix countered. Perhaps their communications are damaged. Perhaps they're refugees fleeing something worse. Or perhaps they're testing our defenses, the Felnor shot back, seeing if we've grown soft. High Councillor Vexnar listened to both sides, his four eyes thoughtful. Finally, he made his decision. We trust Admiral Morrison's judgment. He has earned that much. The unknown ships reached weapons range of Vega Colony. Coalition vessels surrounded them, weapons locked. One wrong move and the battle would begin. Jake sat on the bridge of the Defiant, his finger hovering over the command to fire. Then, finally, the lead ship responded. The face that appeared on screen was reptilian, but not Zrath. Smaller, with softer features. The being looked exhausted and frightened. Coalition vessels, please. We mean no harm. Our communications were damaged in a recent attack. We're seeking asylum. Asylum from what? Jake asked. From the Vornell Collective. They're a machine intelligence that's consuming everything in our sector. We're all that's left of the Krintar people. 12 ships, carrying our entire civilization. Please. We need help. Jake studied the being's face, looking for deception. He saw only desperation. The same desperation he'd seen in human refugees, in Zrath prisoners, in everyone who'd ever needed saving. Stand by, Jake said, then muted the channel. He turned to Lisa, who stood at her usual post. Opinion? Could be a trick, could be truth. We won't know until we board their ships or let them dock. Lisa met his eyes. What does your gut say? Jake thought about everything they'd learned, about pragmatism and principles, about survival and morality, about the difference between necessary force and excessive force. My gut says they're telling the truth. But I've been wrong before. He opened the channel again. Krintar vessels, this is Admiral Morrison. You will power down all weapons and submit to inspection. If your story checks out, we'll grant asylum. If it doesn't, we'll respond accordingly. Do you accept these terms? Yes, the being said immediately. Thank you. Thank you. The inspection took 3 hours. Coalition teams boarded the Krintar ships and found exactly what was claimed. Refugees, desperate and scared, fleeing something terrible. No weapons beyond basic defense systems, no hostile intent, just people needing help. Jake stood on the Defiance Bridge, watching the Krintar ships dock at Vega Colony. He felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief that he'd made the right call. Unease at how close he'd come to making the wrong one. Kate Sullivan found him there. You did good today, she said. I almost didn't. The old me would have fired first. But you didn't. You've learned. Kate stood beside him, watching the refugee ships. That's the balance we need. The pragmatism to act when necessary, and the wisdom to hesitate when possible. Over the following weeks, the Krintar integration into Coalition space became a case study at the Defense Academy. Jake used it to teach his students about the complexity of real-world decisions, about how the same tactical training that made you deadly also needed to make you thoughtful. Sergeant Danny Price, now an instructor at the Academy, took over some of Jake's teaching duties. Danny represented something important, a human who had learned pragmatic warfare without becoming callous, who understood that every rule you broke came with a cost, and you needed to be sure the cost was worth it. The Zrath War was clear-cut, Danny told his students. Evil Empire tries to conquer everyone. We stop them. Simple. But most situations aren't that simple. Most of the time, you'll face ambiguous threats, unclear intentions, and limited information. That's when the real test comes. One of his students, a young Quellan named Torvin, raised a webbed hand. How do we know when to use human tactics versus coalition protocols? You ask questions, Danny replied. Is immediate action necessary? Is the threat confirmed? Is this the minimum force required? If you can answer yes to all three, then act. If any answer is no or uncertain, then hesitate. But hesitation can get people killed, another student protested. So can action. That's the burden of command. Every decision carries risk. You just have to choose which risk you can live with. At the highest levels of coalition leadership, similar conversations happened. Admiral Chris Bennett worked with alien counterparts to develop new doctrine that blended human pragmatism with coalition principles. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard on both sides. We can't go back to the old ways, Chris said at a strategic planning session. The galaxy isn't safe enough for pure idealism, but we also can't abandon our principles entirely. If we do that, what are we defending? Ambassador Greg Mitchell attended these sessions, representing diplomatic interests. The problem is perception, he said. Half the coalition species see humans as saviors. The other half see us as a necessary evil. We need to be more than just the people who fight dirty. What do you suggest? Counselor Zix asked. We lead by example. We show restraint when possible. We explain our reasoning. We teach not just how to fight like humans, but why we fight the way we do. Greg pulled up casualty statistics. Look at these numbers. Since we started training coalition forces in adaptive tactics, military casualties are down 70%. But civilian casualties are down 90%. Because we're not just more effective at fighting, we're more effective at protecting. The discussion continued for hours, but progress was made. Slowly, painfully, the coalition found its new identity. Not the idealistic collective that thought rules could prevent all conflict. Not the ruthless pragmatist who thought survival justified anything. Something in between. Something that acknowledged both the necessity of force and the importance of restraint. Back at the Defense Academy, Admiral Jake Morrison gathered his senior staff for a review of the new curriculum. Lisa Hayes, Kate Sullivan, Danny Price, and a dozen others who had fought in the HFY War and lived to question what they'd done. We need to add a new course, Jake said. Ethics of Pragmatic Warfare, required for all students, taught by someone who can make them think about the choices they'll face. I'll do it, Laura Stevens said. The former medic had returned to the academy after publishing her book. She'd found her calling in teaching people how to maintain their humanity while doing inhuman things. The first lesson should be about Krathval Prime, Laura continued. About Operation Blackout. About the 200 people who went in knowing most wouldn't come back. About why that was necessary and also terrible. Both things can be true. Jake nodded. Agreed. Show them the cost. Make sure they understand that pragmatic warfare isn't about being tough or cool. It's about being willing to carry burdens that will haunt you forever. One of the newer instructors, a Kryn officer named Vartok, spoke up. Some will say we're being too negative, that we're discouraging necessary action. Good, Jake replied. They should be discouraged. War should always be the last option. What we're teaching them is how to make that last option effective. But if they're not at least a little reluctant to use what they've learned, then we've failed them. Months passed. The Academy graduated another class. Coalition forces faced various threats and handled them with a mixture of force and restraint that would have been unthinkable before the HFY War. The galaxy didn't become peaceful, but it became more stable. One evening, Jake stood at the memorial wall, as he often did. High Counselor Vexnar joined him, another common occurrence. The two had developed an unlikely friendship, bound by shared trauma and shared growth. I've been thinking about legacy, Vexnar said. What we'll be remembered for. Probably as the generation that abandoned 3 centuries of principles, Jake replied. Or as the generation that saved civilization by adapting to reality. Vexnar touched the wall of names. These people didn't die so we could feel good about ourselves. They died so others could live. That's a worthy legacy. Even if half the galaxy thinks we're monsters? Especially then. Anyone can do the right thing when it's easy and everyone agrees. It takes courage to do the right thing when it's hard and everyone judges you for it. A priority alert interrupted their conversation. Both men's communicators activated simultaneously. A new threat at the edge of Coalition space. A massive fleet, bigger than the Zrath had ever fielded, heading directly for populated systems. Jake and Vexnar looked at each other, then moved quickly toward the command center. As they walked, Jake felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders. The weight of decisions. The weight of responsibility. The weight of knowing that sometimes doing what must be done meant becoming what you never wanted to be. But he also felt something new. Confidence that they could face this threat without losing themselves completely. Trust that the Coalition had learned its lessons. Hope that they could protect people without becoming monsters in the process. The command center was already active when they arrived. Admiral Chris Bennett was coordinating initial responses. Ambassador Greg Mitchell was attempting diplomatic contact. The entire Coalition military apparatus, now trained in both traditional and pragmatic methods, prepared to defend their space. Status? Jake asked. Unknown hostile force, estimated 400 vessels, Chris reported. Their broadcasting demands: surrender immediately or face total annihilation. Response options? The old Coalition would have tried negotiation. The Zarath War Coalition would have hit them immediately. Chris looked at Jake. What does the new Coalition do? Jake studied the tactical display, his mind running through scenarios. Attack patterns, defensive positions, diplomatic openings, everything they'd learned over the past 3 years. Then he smiled slightly. We do what must be done, Jake said. But first, we figure out what that actually is. He opened a channel to the hostile fleet. Unknown vessels, this is Admiral Jake Morrison of the Coalition Defense Forces. State your grievances and your terms. You have 1 hour to respond before we consider you an active threat. Be aware that we are not the Coalition you may have heard about. We are not bound by outdated protocols. But we are also not mindless aggressors. Respond, and we'll talk. Attack, and you'll learn what pragmatic warfare really means. The channel closed. Everyone in the command center looked at Jake. He'd just threatened and offered diplomacy in the same breath, shown strength and restraint simultaneously. Embodied exactly what the Coalition had become, capable of terrible things but only when necessary. Now we wait, Jake said, and we prepare for either option. Vexnar stood beside him watching the display. You've changed, the counselor said quietly. During the Zarath War, you would have attacked by now. During the Zarath War, we didn't have choices. Now we do. Jake turned to face Vexnar. You taught me that. You and Kate and Laura and everyone who made me question whether efficiency was the same as rightness. I'm still figuring out the answer, but at least now I know to ask the question. The hour passed. The hostile fleet responded. They had demands, some reasonable, some not. They had grievances, some legitimate, some exaggerated. They had fear, deep fear of the Coalition's new reputation for ruthless effectiveness. Negotiations began. Sometimes they stalled, and the Coalition demonstrated military capability to remind the hostiles why diplomacy was preferable. Sometimes progress was made, and the Coalition offered concessions to show good faith. It was messy, complicated, and frustratingly slow. But it worked. 3 weeks later, a treaty was signed. The hostile fleet, actually a confederation of species that felt threatened by Coalition expansion, gained protections and trade rights. The Coalition gained security guarantees and new allies. Nobody got everything they wanted, but nobody had to die. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant as the former hostile fleet departed peacefully. Lisa Hayes smiled at him from her station. Bet you never thought you'd become a diplomat. Bet I never thought I'd see the day when humans talked first and shot second, Jake replied. We're learning. Yeah, slowly, painfully, but we're learning. That night, Jake recorded a message for the Defense Academy archives, something for future students to watch and understand. My name is Admiral Jake Morrison. During the Zarath War, I did things that I'll never be proud of. I killed people. I broke rules. I became what I needed to become to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. For a long time, I thought that was the only way. I thought survival required brutality, and anyone who said otherwise was naive. I was wrong. Not about the necessity of pragmatism, but about the cost of losing ourselves to it. Yes, sometimes we have to fight dirty. Sometimes we have to do terrible things. But those times should be rare, should be questioned, should be regretted. The moment we stop questioning our methods is the moment we become the enemy. What I'm teaching you is how to do what must be done. But more importantly, I'm teaching you to know what must be done versus what we want to do. That's the difference between a defender and a conqueror. That's the difference between humanity at its best and humanity at its worst. You'll face impossible choices. You'll question yourselves. You'll wonder if you're doing the right thing. Good. That doubt is healthy. It keeps you human, or Quellen, or Kryn, or whatever species you are. It keeps you grounded in the principles we're supposed to be defending. Fight when you must. Hesitate when you can. Question everything, including yourselves. And remember that the goal isn't to win. The goal is to protect. Those are not always the same thing. Jake ended the recording and sent it to the Academy archives. Then he walked to his quarters, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. The weight of command, the burden of responsibility, the cost of being the person who makes decisions that affect millions of lives. But he also felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the acceptance of complexity. The understanding that sometimes there were no good answers, only less bad ones. The knowledge that he was doing his best in an impossible situation. That night, the coalition slept safely, defended by people who knew how to fight but also knew when not to, protected by principles that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt stronger. Guided by leaders who understood that strength without wisdom was just violence, and wisdom without strength was just words. They called it pragmatic warfare. Humans called it doing what must be done. But both terms meant the same thing now. The careful balance between capability and restraint, between power and responsibility, between what you can do and what you should do. The galaxy remained dangerous. New threats would emerge. Hard choices would continue to be necessary, but the coalition was ready now, not just to fight, but to think, not just to survive, but to remain worth surviving. And somewhere in the memorial halls, the names of those who had paid the ultimate price looked down on the civilization they had saved, not with regret, but with pride. They had done what must be done so others could choose what should be done. That was their legacy. That was enough. Yaivi, that honor was good, but survival was better. The knowledge that sometimes the people who saved you were also the people you feared, and that was okay. That was human. That was what it meant to do what must be done. The Defiant jumped to faster-than-light travel, heading home. Behind it, a grateful colony rebuilt. Ahead of it, more threats waited. But the coalition was ready now. They had learned from humanity. Not how to be brutal, but how to be practical. Not how to abandon principles, but how to prioritize survival. They had learned that the question wasn't whether to follow rules or break them. The question was, what are you willing to sacrifice to protect those you love? And humanity, scarred by millennia of hard choices, had taught them the answer. Everything. You sacrifice everything. Including your reputation, your innocence, your peace of mind. You become what you must become so others don't have to. You bear the weight so others can stay light. You do what must be done. That was the human way. And now it was the coalition way too. Ed Jake aside and took the hit. The blast tore through Ryan's chest. Jake fired back, again and again, until the Emperor fell. Laura Stevens rushed to Ryan's side, but it was too late. His eyes found Jake's. Worth it, Ryan whispered, then died. The fortress fell. Coalition ships landed and evacuated the prisoners. All 1 million of them. The Zarath forces, leaderless and confused, began surrendering across their empire. But the cost was terrible. Of the 200 who infiltrated the fortress, only 40 came back. Colonel Ben Harris, Commander Ryan Foster, Sergeant Matt Cooper, and dozens of others whose names would be carved into memorial walls. Jake stood in the medical bay as Laura worked on the survivors. Her hands were steady despite everything she'd seen, every horror she'd witnessed. She'd been right to question them. Maybe they had lost something in this war. Maybe they'd become too much like the enemy. But 1 million people were alive. And sometimes, that was the only answer that mattered. Jake was already pulling up star charts, his mind racing through possibilities. We get them back. That's impossible. They're in the Zrath capital system. It's the most heavily defended location in their empire. Then we do the impossible, Jake said. We've already proven we're good at that. Admiral Chris Bennett leaned forward. What do you have in mind? Jake smiled, but there was no humor in it. Something that's going to make everything we've done so far look tame. Something that will save 1 million people and probably make the Coalition hate us forever. Tell me, Chris said. Jake began to explain his plan. As he talked, the other officers in the room grew pale. Even Lisa, who had fought beside him for years, looked shocked. What Jake was proposing wasn't just breaking the rules. It was the kind of operation that people would study for centuries, either as an example of human brilliance or human brutality. Maybe both. But it would work, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Then they can court-martial me. The evacuation took 6 hours. The Defiant's hangar bay became a refugee center, packed with grateful civilians from a dozen species. They thanked the human crew, not understanding that these same humans would likely face prison for saving them. As the Defiant prepared to jump back to Coalition space, Ben stood on the bridge beside Jake. You know they're going to throw everything at you? I know. Was it worth it? Jake looked at the monitor showing the crowded hangar bay. Families reunited. Children who would grow up because someone broke the rules to keep them alive. Yeah, it was worth it. The Defiant jumped to faster-than-light travel, heading back to face justice. Behind them, Meridian Prime burned, but its people lived. Sometimes that was the only victory that mattered. Ake stood alone in the observation deck. Below him, Coalition Station 7 gleamed with lights. Peaceful, orderly, civilized. Everything humanity had tried to become when they joined the galactic community. But sometimes civilization was a luxury you couldn't afford. Sometimes survival meant getting your hands dirty. The Coalition called it barbarism. Humanity called it Tuesday. Jake pulled up the navigation charts for Meridian Prime. 6 hours until the Zrath arrived. The Defiant could make it in 4 if they pushed the engines. That gave them 2 hours to save 10,000 people using every dirty trick humanity had ever learned. He smiled grimly. The Coalition was about to get a real education in human warfare. They wouldn't like it, but they'd be alive to complain about it. That was what mattered.